In this conversation, I'm going to talk about one of those key subjects that makes doctors' blood boil: overhead. For some reason, the two numbers that all doctors seem to know is the practice revenue and the overhead percentage. Overhead is a critical factor. In fact, it is so critical that we should be focusing on it on a weekly basis. Why is it critical? Because if overhead is too high, we're simply losing income. It's just that simple. So let me start by telling you that general practice overhead should be 59% or below. Endo should be 42% or below. Oral surgery, 50% or below. Ortho, 49% or below. Pediatric dentistry, 49% or below. Prosthodontics is the tough one. They typically have a national average of about 71%, and we would like to see them around 64% or below. They're very high due to the laboratory costs. And if I left anybody out, I will think of it and come back to it, because these are truly conversations where we're just working together. Perio, that's what I left out. I was trying to think of it. Perio should be 51% or below. Now, most of you have overhead 6 to 8% too high. Let me tell you what that means, because this is serious. For every 1% your overhead is too high, that is $1,000 lost on every $100,000 of production. So you're losing $1,000 of income every year by being 1% too high. If you are 8% too high on an $800,000 practice, that is $64,000 of lost income, not revenue, income, bottom line profit to the practice. We see this all the time. Our average client can within 6 months, we can lower overhead by 6 to 8%, and they pick up $50,000 to $60,000 of profit, of income. If you do that for 10 years, think about that. That's $500,000 to $600,000 of profit, take-home income. That's pretty significant. 20 years, that's $1 million to $1.2 million of profit that you are not getting, and you don't work one more hour for it. So overhead is a serious issue. Now, why is your overhead too high? And that's what I want to talk about and converse about. Your overhead is too high not because of waste in most cases. We have worked with over 16,000 practices. We've looked at budgets. We do comparisons for every client to national averages, to Levin Group averages. Where are they? Where will they be in 12 months? That's all about our targets. And what we find is that there isn't huge waste in big barrels, so to speak. In other words, we can't look at a practice and say, 5% is right here. Let's eliminate this 5% and we will lower overhead 5%. We can't seem to do that because most of it is 0.1% here, 0.3% there. It's little bits that are so labor intensive to find and monitor, it's almost not worth it. So I'm going to concede that maybe about 1 to 2%, probably 1% or less, of high overhead is wasted, and the rest is due to something very different. So if your overhead is too high, pay attention to this. If your overhead's too high, it is probably that you are underproducing relative to your resources today. We know that almost every practice in the United States and worldwide has a 30 to 50% minimum growth potential. We have no problem getting many of our clients, the majority of our clients, to grow 30 to 50% in 2 to 3 years. Most grow 18 to 24% in 1 year. Right now is a tough economic year where I'm recording this, but in good economic years, our average client grows 24 to 30% in 1 year. So if you can be up 30 to 50%, what does that mean? Well, the key is you can grow 30 to 50% without raising your fixed overhead, meaning you don't have to buy another chair, you don't have to hire another staff member, you don't have to move an office. We see practices all the time that say, well, I have no more room in my office, and then we redo their schedule with a PowerCell schedule, and we have a 30% increased capacity right there. We get calls, I've got to have an associate, I'm so busy, I can't handle it, and we analyze it, and the answer is, you don't need an associate. You need to clean up your scheduling and your systems, because you can grow 30% before you're going to need an associate. And if you bring in the associate now, there is not enough money for the two of you, which means the associate at the end of a year or two is going to leave, and worst case scenario, open down the street and, restrictive covenants or not, compete with you, even if they open 5 miles and 1 foot away. And in some states, restrictive covenants don't hold up at all. So, based on that, your overhead is too high, mostly because you're underproducing. If you can grow 30% without any new fixed expenses, you've got a gap at 30% where you're underproducing down here, and you could be 30% bigger without adding fixed expenses. I almost wish I had a chart so I could sit here and draw it for you, but you get the idea. So the key to lowering your overhead percentage is increasing your production. It's not the waste, it's the lack of production. And yet we develop habits in the practice to make ourselves feel busy. You say, people say, Roger, I have no more time. When you observe my practice, or your consultant observes my practice, they're going to see I have no more time. You may not know how to do it, but believe me, you've got a 30% capacity minimum to increase production. We haven't seen a practice that doesn't have that in years. So overhead is very serious, $50,000 to $60,000 or more a year being lost. The higher your overhead, the longer you will be in practice, the longer it will take you to reach financial independence. And let me tell you, with the debt levels coming out of school today, the cost of practicing today, overhead is a key factor to look at. It's not that you're wasting a lot. Some people do, we find that, but most don't. It's that you're not producing at the right level. So take this to heart, because one of the fastest ways to build income and reach financial independence 8 years earlier, and this is real data, is to lower your overhead percentage to the targeted numbers I gave you in the beginning of this conversation. So go back, take a look. If you have questions about overhead and want to talk to someone at Levin Group, one of our analysts, we'll be glad to chat with you about it. Just give us a call.